at the 16.5 release, talking through it. I'm also going to share the video blog post.
I think Yuri is a bit
I hope I'll be on stream because there's a thing approaching. So if I'm up, we could do a round of introductions. People are off, everyone. Gregory, do you start?
Yeah, hey, I'm Gregory. I'm a senior engineer working on NX Core, specifically focusing on core improvements and plugin improvements. Jack, do you want to introduce yourself?
Okay, yeah, I'll go next. I think Yuri might be hanging a bit. That's okay. Yeah, I'm Jack. I'm also part of the NX team, and I focus mostly on the plugin side, so a lot of React, Angular, like Vite, Webpack, all that stuff. That's outside the core. I'm in charge of most of that. And Jason, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm Jason. I work on the core of NX and also oversee a lot of the different efforts. And I'll popcorn it over to Miro.
Hey, I'm Miro. I'm also a member of the team. I'm working mostly on linter and our CI tooling.
All right, and looks like I'm back. As I mentioned, thunderstorm outside. So I'm mostly working on the content part, DevRel, and you probably see me and Zach quite often on YouTube and all that type of stuff. Cool. Before we go right in, I wanted to show a quick thing first, which is our new changelog. I'm actually going to post it also in our chat so people can kind of check it out. We didn't do a whole lot of promotion around it yet. Because it's something that we just started trying out. And so if you go here, you should see my screen by now. So basically what we did is in our documentation at the very bottom there in the menu, there's a changelog entry now. And the main goal of this changelog entry is to surface some of our content in a better fashion. So starting with January, we started having like a blog post for every minor release. We sometimes group them just as we did this time. For instance, this blog post was about 16.0 to 16.5. So we grouped some of those features into one blog post. And we have a ton of video about those type of features that come out. And so we wanted to group them together in a better form so people can actually jump to this page, go in, see what deprecations are potentially happening in some of the releases. There will be some more featured ones, such as the major releases mostly, or like basically feature releases compared to some of the the smaller ones that you see here in between, which is mostly patches and bug fixes. And so you can, again, reiterate on some of the release notes that we have here, as well as jump directly to the actual GitHub changelog where you see all the details and can then jump into the comments. So we're keep improving this. So this is one of the first releases that we just put out there, and then we will keep iterating on it and add some more interesting stuff that might be useful for you all to kind of find these things later on after release has been out. One thing to mention as well in these kind of set of releases is for the Angular part of the things, we have also added in now the 16.1 support. So in our migrations, whenever you upgrade, you can now basically upgrade automatically also the Angular. So that will be part of your migration. On that side, something also to mention is that now we support all Angular LTS versions. So prior, it was always that Angular and NX would go with the same major version. We decoupled that a couple of versions back, such that now you can upgrade to the latest NX version and still keep basically your Angular version as is. And this is sometimes necessary, obviously, because you might not be able to upgrade Angular just yet because you're blocked on some third-party project or something, third-party library. But if you want to still maybe go ahead with NX or some of the features that we release. Cool. The next part that we might jump in is Next.js. Zach, do you want to talk about that?
Sure.
Like features that we added?
Yeah, so this change, like most users may not really notice the difference unless they did a lot of customization on their workspace or their apps. But we changed the way we integrate with Next.js. So previously we were calling in some of the actual like internal APIs to start the Next.js server and stuff. It causes some issues, especially when you try to integrate with TurboPack, which doesn't have the same programmatic API that we can call. The only way that you can do it is through the CLI. And there's also like some other problems with calling it the way we were doing it before. So currently what we do is we do the API call, the CLI call on Next.js CLI, but we provide a with NX function for their Next.js plugin or the Next.js config. And we add in some like NX specific features like pointing to workspace libraries, additional things like SVG, R support, and other things that people might be using. And this will allow us to keep up with some of the newer experiments on the Next.js side, because like people want to use TurboPack, they couldn't do it before NX16. Even things like app layout, there are some additional things that are hard to support without going through the CLI. And it's not just NX, it's like anyone who's using like a custom server and they're spinning up Express and blah, 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 they run into the same issues. They can see like tons of GitHub issues open about it. I guess the one thing that it might not work for some apps is if they use a custom server. In the past, we actually allowed users to point to a custom Express server, and we can spin that up and serve it the same way that we do normally. That's not been the case for quite a while, so we deprecated that support like long time ago, but we didn't remove the support. Now when we convert it to the CLI, it's just not possible to support because it's not a Next.js feature. So for people who do have that setup, which I think is not too many, what you can do is run the NXG custom server generator within the Next.js plugin, and it'll set up Express server again. And basically, this time around, it's going to go through our node executor, so it doesn't rely on Next.js having this feature, right? And it's just a lot better to use this. We can actually properly support it because this is no different than running like actual Express server. We don't even care that it's a Next.js server at this point. So if you are using the deprecated, or I guess the removed custom server setup, run this generator, you'll get 2 new targets, one to build the custom server and one to serve it for development. And that should be it. Is there anything I missed?
I'm currently actually going through that part there, right? And I should probably update my blog post, which I've written like I think 1.5 years, 2 years ago, that used that deprecated custom server. So I should go back probably and fix that. But yeah, that's basically what you meant, right? Where you basically can generate a new NX Next custom server, right? And that would give you then this main file here, which is basically, like as you said, like an Express server setup.
Yeah, and we set up some environment variables to make sure like things are wired up properly between both the dev server and also the production build server. So this is more robust. And I know for the deprecated custom server setup, there's been like a long-standing issue, and people have chimed in. And there's like so many things that we can't support super well just because it's not something that Next.js supports. So at least with this setup, it is removing ourselves from having to support all those things. Things are basically just not possible. So definitely check it out if you have that. There's also a flag or an option for the app generator when you create a new Next.js app. You can pass in the custom server flag and it'll do it automatically, so you don't have to like run it again.
And in addition, this is also what I've set up here is the new standalone support as well, right? So we have like the non-monorepo NX setup, which we have been introducing for a couple of like our plugins recently, now also for Next.js, which is kind of this setup that we have. We just have an application here, not really a monorepo per se, right?
Yeah. So I guess what the create NX workspace command, we changed a few things. One is you can tell it to use either the app layout or the pages layout for Next.js. Previously, we just generated with the pages, and then you can convert it manually yourself. Now, by default, everything's the app layout, which is like, I guess, aligned with the actual Next.js project, because they also default that to the app layout. So you can choose one or the other. Most of the more exciting features are in the app layout, so if it works for you, like I would check it out. If it doesn't work due to whatever reason, you can always go back to the page's layout.
Exactly. A couple of people already start mentioning what their favorite features are in the chat, like the dependency rules. And we are going to talk about some of these like during the stream today. This one, especially also the whole Verdaccio setup and how to kind of locally publish packages to that Verdaccio setup. Cool. Another feature that we introduced, or is there anything left on Next.js, Jack, before we jump on?
No, that's it. If you couldn't update it before because of the lack of like turbo pack or whatever, like definitely check out the latest NX. Everything should be working.
Cool. Another feature that we had be introduced, and this is actually really cool one because this is a community contributed one, which is targeting by tags. I think it has been sitting around for a while, right? And on our GitHub as a PR. And we had seen it. We had discussed it a couple of times internally. Should we implement it? How should we implement it? I think initially Jay brought it up, right? If I'm not wrong. Jay brought it up, but then it kind of got lost there. And then we picked it up then later. And I can briefly bring that up as well. And Jason, you had been involved, I think, into that one, right?
Yeah, I went over it when it was originally opened, and was kind of back and forth on it, but a lot of people seem to want the feature, so we decided to merge it in. There was a PR before this by Jay that kind of like kicked things off, Jay Bell, and then Florian opened another one which had a better solution. So we looked over this one and we worked with Florian on kind of updating it to how we thought it should be designed. So it took a while, but it was finally ended in, and now like you can run print affected, run many, like anything that you can target projects with, you can now use tags. So it's all like if you have inputs that take into like some projects, there's also implicit dependencies and stuff like that. So like if you ever see either like an option or a CLI option that's called projects, you can expect for the same syntax to work there.
So basically, this is something that can be applied like on the run many and the affected, where we had already a couple of filtering of possibilities now, right? Where we allow you to run many tests on all the various projects that are in the workspace, which then get parallelized across all of them. Or we also kind of allowed to kind of filter by projects, right? Where we would list projects one by one. I think even globs to some degree, right? Where you can even glob them based on a naming pattern. So if you have like some kind of unique prefixes like feed the dash, I don't know, for feature libraries, you could actually filter it by that. And the new syntax, I think, allows you now to do something like this, right? Where you have tag, I actually need to look at my notes, tag and then type feature, for instance. And these would now run them just on those features that have that tag on them. So basically, in this case, we have the product detail page. So I should find here that tag basically somewhere. Exactly, right? So this has the tag feature, and therefore we can kind of now filter across them by basically passing that syntax tag colon and then whatever string you use for your tags, right? And I keep reminding people also like these strings, like we keep using type colon and scope colon, those type of things, because they work out pretty well. But this is actually just an arbitrary string, right? So you can pass whatever you want basically in these strings in here and organize however you want them.
Yeah, I think for this particular feature, I think scope will be a kind of good one to go about so that you can kind of just worry about one domain area of your application.
Yeah.
And then in general, like make sure to check out how we recommend tagging things. We don't really like enforce a way to tag things. You can do it however you want, but I'd really think about like your projects in different dimensions. So like the two ones that we recommend a lot are the scope, which is your domain area. You don't want like domain areas reaching into each other like unintentionally. And then the other one is type, so that you can kind of like enforce that UI can only depend on state and not the other way around and stuff like that. So
yeah, exactly.
this kind of like brings tags into a not just linting kind of world, but it's also a selector for like a set of projects.
Yeah. Yeah. So go ahead, Gregory.
Yeah, and the other use case where this is super valuable is if you have CI pipelines and a certain set of projects that has to run on like Mac OS, for example, if you're running Apple, iOS builds.
That's
If
actually a
you
good one.
apply a tag that's like OS:Mac or something like that, then you can have run mini on Mac, and you can use them in the exclude field as well to exclude them from your other pipeline.
Yeah. That's pretty much like expand into new dimension almost, right? Where it's, as Jason mentioned, not just used for pure module boundary rules kind of enforcement. And for people that are not aware about this or haven't used it yet, there is a docs page here, which here is calling enforcing project boundaries, which goes a bit through the whole concept of like what these tags are and how they can be used. Also, our tutorials that we have here, both the Angular and the React standalone one, have a section in there where if you go further down, there is a part which talks about the modularization approach of your application with local libraries. And then there's also a point of then afterwards how you can use these module boundary rules, these tags basically, and then lint rules to enforce and make sure that the boundaries stay kind of isolated. And so this is a very, very good approach for like long-term maintainability, obviously, which you might encounter in a monorepo scenario. Cool. Anything else you want to add there? People want to mention?
Just again, thank you for the community contribution. It's one of those things where we didn't want to spend time on it, but we thought it was going to be a good feature. So the fact that the community stepped forward and did that, like we appreciate it a lot.
Yeah, 100%. All right. The next one I have on my list here, at least, is the whole Verdaccio support and create your own CLI. So it goes very much into the whole plugin development thing. Gregory, do you want to jump on that, since I know you've been working quite a lot in that area?
Yeah, I can talk through it. So the Verdaccio support is essentially, we set up a target on your workspace that lets you host a local version of the NPM registry. So if you're publishing packages to NPM and you need to test them, you can think of it almost as an alternative to something like NPM Link to be able to install it in other workspaces. It goes a little bit beyond that. And it was actually a necessary piece of being able to test the create CLI packages that we offered. So you get a full featured NPM registry that you can hit, and your tests are hitting a real NPM registry. It's just one you're hosting.
But for those that missed the blog post, I think we should go over like what the create CLI is.
Yeah.
Because we haven't gone over that yet.
Yeah. So with the create CLI stuff, essentially we have refactored create NX workspace internally to provide a public API that other tooling can come in and wrap to be able to publish their own CLI if they were to be like creating their own framework and wanting to have a command that you can run via NPX. So like the example here in this blog post is the create quick NX my app, where you can consume our public API to make that CLI really easily. Yeah, and then like I said, when you're testing that locally, you get a full NPM registry, so you're able to just use NPX wherever you want because it is published to your version of NPM when you're running your tests.
Yeah. So the Quick NX example that we used here quite a lot also in our blog post is because we have been collaborating with them since they have been very proactive in wanting to have, like they're big NX fans, big Quick fans, and so they wanted to combine both of them, but have an experience from the ground up that is focused on quick development, right? And so they actually wanted from the beginning to leverage a feature that we had, which is called presets, right, in our NX plugin development approach, where you can not just have like first NX set up your workspace and then you just install a plugin on top of it, but rather you can control the entire experience from the very beginning, right? And so up until now, just for people to kind of have like a context on this, is you usually needed to kind of publish your package on NPM, and this is your NPM package name, and then you could instantiate that workspace via the create NX workspace and passing that -- preset, right? But like usually what you see, especially if it's like more of like an auto-consistent kind of setup, they want to brand their own CLI. So they want to rather than going through something like this, they want to have like actually something like this, right, where they brand it with their own setup basically. And so that's what we started doing, right?
Yeah, and we, for example, like Create NX plugin uses the same API, so it's not something that we only use with Create NX Workspace. It's something we're dogfooding to be able to make sure it works well.
Yeah, and so you can create this thing from the very beginning, right? So if you create a new workspace, you can pass it as a flag.
Yeah, if you're
Or
creating a new
alternatively-
plugin, it should prompt you.
Yeah, exactly. Or alternatively, I think you can, what is it called?
It's create package, I think. Yeah.
A package, right? There's a generator here that then sets up a package. In this case, I've this samples workspace here. I've used the name create my own React app, kind of like going a bit vintage with the create React app, the obsolete create React app stuff. And so this kind of basically imports the create workspace function, and then you can do here whatever you really want inside, right? So you can have your prompts. In this case, I even like pulled in like Clack, which is a pretty popular one recently, where you can kind of use that API to query for parameters that you want to have, and then ultimately you invoke the create workspace part here, which is a function that then calls your plugins preset function, right? Which is then somewhere in here. Where you would then get all these options that you have queried the user from. And then you can just proceed with the usual like NX plugin kind of APIs to configure your workspace.
Yeah, I want to like put it in a different light. Because I think if we go back in time, like 10 years ago, where AngularJS was like the king, I think like a big reason why React became so popular is because it was easy to set up. Because they did have a create React app. And like nowadays, if we look at many different technologies like NX, like Next, like even Angular and Nest, right? Like they all have a quick way of getting started with their technology. And as a kind of framework for creating code generation and also like creating build infrastructure, we think like NX is a perfect place for you to kind of just like get started really quickly in building that for whatever framework comes down the road. So the fact that like frameworks like Quick and other frameworks are looking into this, like we hope that it allows you to adopt more users more quickly without having to go through all the trouble of writing your own code generation and your own CLI. So really, like you are getting a workspace, or you're getting a CLI that users can use to create a workspace that uses your technology. Quick, analog, whoever comes next. And like the fact that it uses NX is just kind of like a byproduct. It's like it just happens to use TypeScript, and it just happens to use like ESLint out of the box. But the main feature is the technology that you're creating.
Yeah, I see it almost like at that point you use NX almost as your platform you built on top, right? And I also feel like I actually talked before we started developing on this with a couple of framework authors, and many of them have nowadays a CLI because it's just the easiest way to onboard people, right? But then if you keep talking to them a bit more, they're like, oh, it's such a pain to maintain and pull onwards because it always feels just like as that side effort. And now if you're lucky, you have a good community involvement already, and the community kind of pushed it forward, so you don't have to care about it as a framework author, right? You can rather focus on the framework implementation itself. But so that's kind of the target that we are kind of wanting to help out because we had it already. Like our job is to build a good CLI, and so the whole kind of opening that up made it a really nice experience in the end. I think it would also be interesting to see first what Gregory mentioned in terms of the Verdaccio setup, because in this case here now, the Verdaccio setup is kind of embedded, right? So you don't really see it. There's this config file, but as Gregory has mentioned before.
Can we explain, what Verdaccio is for anyone who may not
sure,
know?
100%. So Verdaccio, let's go here. It's kind of like as a page here, it says lightweight Node.js private proxy registry. So basically, it's like your Node, your NPM registry set up locally, right? And so especially if you develop those plugins, but in general, this works also across like NPM publishing in general, right? If you have like a workspace, a monorepo where you want to develop NPM packages and publish them, so rather than publishing a beta version, or as Gregor mentioned, NPM linking them between workspace to test them out, you could actually set up such a Verdaccio registry locally, start it up and publish it to that one and consume it as the end user would consume it then once it is online, right? And so that is what kind of Verdaccio gives you. You could even host this in your company as a proper local registry. So obviously this is not just for testing purposes, but we've been using this for quite a while now on the NX repo itself. And so what we did in this whole iteration as well is just make this whole thing much nicer in the sense of packaging it up in like such an executor, right? Such that you can just launch this. Because in this specific case here, for instance, you can just say then an X local registry, which would be that kind of entry here on this my own React app, which is the whole project here. And this would now launch this up locally. You can see here the Verdaccio server is being spun up. It obviously has no packages. I believe we even cleared them up, right, when we started. So we always start with a clean setup, because this again is for testing purposes. And then in this case, I could even go ahead and say publish the package. So I do a run many command. I run the publish target, which exists here on my package here, and the create CLI, the CLI basically. And then let me increase this version here. And this would now run the publish automatically on this one, because the setup does not only spin up Verdaccio, but it also redirects the NPM pointers to go to that local version. And then it falls back to the NPM one, because the Verdaccio, I believe, config mentions something like, uplinks that then obviously point to the official one. And so going back now to Verdaccio, if we refresh, we should now see our packages. And so now you can actually consume them doing normal NPM installs as you would do if they were actually on the actual public NPM registry. So just to recap what Gregory described before.
Yeah, and the other part is when you kill your registry, we undo all of those settings for you, so you don't have to worry about them hanging around and messing with you later.
Yeah, we fall into that trap a couple of times at an X repo, right? It was still pointing to the wrong one, and it did a bunch of installs. Cool. Next thing I have in the list, and actually, by the way, before we jump on, going away from the creating your own CLI, shout out to the stream that we have on Thursday with Zach again and Brendan. They talk about Analog, and Analog actually right now has an RFC open where they actually think about potentially using NX exactly in this setup where they use NX to brand their own CLI and use the NX generators to set up new Analog projects, because right now it's kind of like a custom spin-up solution. And so they're currently evaluating exactly that, especially also because they leverage already some of our executors like the Vite one. So it kind of makes sense in their area. So definitely chime in on Thursday, usual time, on our YouTube with Zach and Brandon. So next one on the list is external dependencies input type. Miro, do you want to talk a bit more about that while I pull up our blog post?
Yeah, sure. So external dependencies input is one of those critical features that most people wouldn't care about or wouldn't use, but those that would use it, they are desperately needing something like this. So this has been something that folks requested for a long time. It wasn't really specified how it was supposed to work, but generally, when we talk about affected graph, whenever we change something in a project, we can detect which files were changed. Then we see where these files belong to. So we check which projects contain these files, and we mark those projects as affected. And then furthermore, we check the projects that depend on those projects. So we create like affected graph. But then there are a couple of files which are kind of general files like Next.js or package.json or your log file. Now, when these files change, we can't really tell what could be affected, so we simply mark everything as affected. Now, for a long time, this was our solution, but then we started working on it and we realized that, well, this is fundamentally broken, so we don't care if the entire log file has changed. We probably care about just the packages that affect our project. So instead of considering a log file as a black box or a box that you don't know what happens inside, we started parsing the log file. And then we could actually create the entire graph of dependencies, so we could tell exactly which external dependencies your project depends on. So only when those dependencies have changed, then we mark your project as affected. Now, the problem comes when we're actually running the command. We aren't checking just the project and the files that have affected the project directly, but we also need to consider your executor. An executor could be depending on one of those change packages. Now, if you're using one of the NX packages like Next.js or NX Webpack, then we know which dependencies this executor depends on, and we can automatically check if one of those dependencies have been changed. But the issue was whenever you used something more generic like run commands or just command, we can't really tell what you're actually running inside that command and what that learn and publish, for example, in this case, might depend on. Like just by looking at it, we can say, okay, it's learner, but it could be just calling some script, and who knows what could be behind that script. So in order to be kind of pessimistic about it and to rather have cache miss than false cache hit, we decided to just, whenever we can't distinguish what this command depends on, to simply say, well, whatever changes in the log file, everything is affected. The problem is folks that are, for example, running Docker and they want to publish something, they know that their Docker push doesn't depend on any external dependencies change. But still, whenever you change something, for example, if you are making new versions, everything would be affected. And this was causing a lot of false publishing or a lot of pressure on CI. So the external dependencies actually gives you power to restrict the amount of dependencies. So whenever we don't know what your executor depends on, you can simply say that it depends only on these packages. So in this case, we can say we're running learn publish, so we can specify that our external dependencies for this command is just learn. You could also specify just an empty array, which would mean that there's no external dependencies that could influence my command. And this would be useful for something like Docker push, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, obviously we wouldn't want to kind of parse these strings in these commands direct in these run commands. So it's actually quite a nice addition here to further fine tune to the existing inputs. And actually here there's a video. You can see it right now linked in just our blog post here, but these are going public as well. I believe in the next couple of days, where Zach actually goes a bit more deeper into overall the inputs in NX, right? So we have, like, you can really dive deeper into those in terms of more fine tuning for your caching. Including the ones that Mira just mentioned here. That is a new one that we added recently.
There's also quite a confusion between what affected is and what tasks are, right, and then what caching is. And this is where people often got confused because they expected, okay, if I just run affected, then probably any change in the log file could be affecting those packages because we don't know what target you want to run. But if I specify affected build, then I was expecting that, well, you see, my build is just running learner, so why would it be affected? But in fact, we couldn't really tell. And especially since a lot of targets can depend on runtime environment conditions, which you can't know unless you actually start the command. So some of this information we only get while running the command. That's why this whole logic happens during the hashing and during the check whether it should be cached or not, whether we have already cached for this specific command in this project or not. And as I said, since there are some runtime variables in play, we only can tell this when we actually run it. So that's why simply by running something like print affected, we can't really tell if it's affected or not. We need to actually run the command, and then we either bring it from cache or we run it again.
Cool. And kind of related to move on to the next one is also a new lint rule. I don't know why it's kind of related, but it's kind of ties into kind of controlling, restricting some of our like dependencies that you might have, or out of filling some of those dependencies. And it's also related because you worked on it. So there's a new rule that we introduced, which is NX dependency checks. So do you want to jump briefly into that? And I believe you can actually show it even in the create my own React app CLI setup that we have shown before.
So those two things are definitely related, and they had the same precondition, and that was our ability to actually parse the log file and to know which exact dependencies we have, and not just the names of the dependencies, but also the exact versions. So now whenever you are bundling your application, whenever you want to publish your application, we are checking what dependencies your application depends on. And then we use this information to create the package.json and prune log file with the exact versions. Now, while doing this, we realized that we had some issue with our previous code that was doing this. And the same code we were actually using for publishable libraries, where we would detect again dependencies, and we would create a log file. We would create package.json with command generate package.json. Now, we realized that this is not something we probably want to do for libraries. We still want to do it for applications, because for applications, you probably need the exact version that you're using, and you do benefit from the pruned log file. But for libraries, you probably want to control the version. So for example, you might have something like here, tslib that is greater than 2.3.0, but maybe your actual library can accept any tslib between version 1 and 3, for example, right? And that's something we can't tell, because in the root package.json, where we normally get information, or from the log file, we don't have such ranges. So we can't really tell what your library can accept as a range. So this is something that users more likely would like to do on their own. But we still want to give them a hand so that they don't miss some dependency, or they don't have some dependencies that are left over from some previous code. So what this new linter rule does, it will actually, again, analyze your code. It will collect all the dependencies, and then it will check your package.json, and it will report any dependency that's missing, any dependency that is now obsolete, or any dependencies whose range doesn't match the one you have installed. So whenever you set some range, we want to make sure that the version you have installed, the version that is in your log file, fits in that range. Otherwise, you would be simply using some range that you have never tested your library with. So we want to make sure that the version you have should be within that.
But I feel like, especially even in this case, right, where let's say like here, this is my CLI that we have set up before, and I'm importing here clack because I want to use it for my prompts, then very easily I might not kind of use, or like forget to import it here, because maybe I've hosted it up in like my root level package.json file, right, like up here. And so this would run build locally. This would be fine, right? But then obviously if I publish it and someone tries to install it from npm, it would fail, because like you wouldn't have that dependency come with it, right? While here in my development workspace setup, I have it at the root level. And so to set this up, basically all we need to do is in the project level, yes, lint rc JSON, right? We register the new rule, specify like which files it should kind of check for, right? Like in this case, the JSON files.
Yeah, so it's checking just package.json, so you could even change this.
Yeah, I was about to say,
it could even package.json.
Exactly, I could even say like something like this, right? Where I say it's just going to package.json. Do we need to do something else still? Like for for the lint one,
so,
right? We need to.
So by default, at the moment, still, a lint file patterns just add .ts files, for example, or .ts and .js files. So you would have to add the package.json. We are at the moment finishing the PR where this would be automatically added to all the buildable libraries. So whenever you build a new buildable libraries using one of the NX packages, we would automatically add the lint rule and also the missing package.json as a lint file pattern.
But basically, so when I run this now, just to see the effect here as well. Like if I removed it in my package.json, so it now kind of complain about it. So it says like, hey, look, there's like this exact package missing, right? And so I could even now go, and this is kind of like the way where you could now again auto generates to some degree, right? Where you can pass the -- fix to automatically add that back in. So if I run the fix command here, it would now pass, and if I go back into my package.json, I can see that the actual dependency has been re-added again.
I guess to elaborate on it a little bit more, like Miro mentioned, we have the generate package.json for some of our executors like TSC, SWC, ESBuild, or whatever. People have relied on that to help generate their package.json before they publish it, right? So their actual published JSON, their source, has no dependencies, like empty. And if they have some dependencies, we merge it together. And we've had like issues in the past where people are asking for post-processing, like, oh, once you generate the package.json, can you call a script so I can post-process it? Which I think is the wrong way to solve it, because the problem they have is basically the one that's generated is not exactly what they want. Maybe the range is slightly off and other things, right? So this is solving it by not having that as part of the executor. Like when you run build, it just copies the file over. There's no like manipulation of the file, so there's no post-processing required. And instead, we use this lint, which has a fixed flag that you showed. And you get the same behavior as before, where we can auto-populate certain things if you are trying to keep things in sync and not have errors that are detectable by NX. But then we step away, and then you can just manage it yourself. We don't try to do anything that will not match what you want.
Yeah, I feel it's a good compromise, right? Where it gives you very, very good control over it, but still gives you like the warnings if something's go wrong, and even the possibility to how to fix it. And there's a question coming up that's kind of related for this. Like, could the lint rule for package.json files be extracted to an ESLint plugin /config, so that it wouldn't have to be written manually, same way the default NX rules apply to JavaScript, TS, and React code?
I mean, the ESLint plugin within the NX is also extracted as a separate ESLint plugin. So the same way how we use this for manipulating the package.json, the same way it can be done by anyone else. If I understood the question correctly.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether the idea was to be able to actually have this at a more higher level, like at the root level, ESLint config somehow defined. But like this is specific for each project, right? So it should look at the dependency of the project level thing.
We had initial discussion about
was quite
this.
a thunder.
We had the discussion initially whether we want to have this set up once for entire repo, or whether we want to have it per project. And then if we would have it in a root, we would have to have additional restrictions. Like we don't necessarily want to run this for applications because it doesn't really make sense. And we want to have it for libraries, but we want to leave user also possibility to be able to kind of switch it on and off depending on which projects they want. So if we would have it in the root, it would be kind of tricky. You would have to switch it off. It's rather easier to just turn it on for projects that you want.
I think now the clarification is that like we're not grouping them into like a plugin you can just put there and it'll apply to everything, because like there probably will be exceptions that you will need to configure, like some ignores. For example, even in our code base, we have some places where we're not importing because we're like, well, that package may not be there, but if it is, then we'll try to require and use it. In those cases, it's not going to be in your package.json. It's fine. So the lint rule might say like, hey, you have an error, and then you as a user know better. You're like, it's not an error, so you add it to the ignore. But you probably don't want to apply that to like the entire workspace. So in this case, it's more ergonomic, I think, to have it specified per project, and you can configure it per project. And I think the other way around would be more error prone. Yeah,
I mean, you can still do it, but as Jack mentioned, it makes more sense to have it per project so that you can really tailor it. Like you can specify things like name of the build target. By default, it takes just build. But if your build target is called something else, then you have to do it per project. Also, as Jack mentioned, some of the packages might not be accurately parsed, so you want to override that simply by saying that, hey, I don't need this package because it belongs to some secondary entry point that never gets published, or maybe something is not detected, but you know it should be there. Like some peer dependency, maybe that's not cleared by just parsing the code.
Oh no.
Yuri is okay.
Yuri
Is he
might
like
have been,
offline or is he just
let's say it's offline. Is there
Okay.
anything else that we want to add for the dependency check rule?
No, I think I guess one thing to clarify is we are, like Miro mentioned, we're reworking some of the generators for like JS libraries and stuff. So in the future, we'll also provide a migration. People don't have to configure it manually. But if you do want to do it manually, for now, there's a documentation, which I think is linked in the blog post. So read the blog post and take it from there.
Yeah, Jack is also reworking some part of it, improving some dependency detection. And then, as you mentioned, we will provide migration, and it's planned for version 17 that the library generation of package.json will be gone completely. So we'll deprecate it soon, and then in version 17 there will be only this linter rule. So the current
and we'll still have
generation-
the package.json generation for apps because we need the
For
log
apps,
posts
yes.
and everything. But it'll warn you. Basically, if you use it for library, it might not do what you think it does in version 17. I think that's about it for that topic. We can move on to the next one.
Okay, so the next thing we wanted to talk about is the performance improvements that we've been working on NX. So there's like two big areas that we're focusing on how to improve the performance of NX. One of those is to move some of the core of NX into Rust. So Rust is a pretty memory efficient language, so the kind of allocation of memory and the freeing up of the space makes a lot of operations faster, as well as it's easy to parallelize things since like Node is single threaded. So like two of the places that we have moved there are the hasher. So we now hash projects in Rust. And it's also going to be the project file map. So before we were kind of like walking through the project, like through all of your files, kind of like multiple times. And this is kind of the most expensive part in a large monorepo. So we've consolidated that into like a single pass. So we walk through all of the files once and we pass back all of the details that you want. So all of the files are hashed in that one pass. And in the same pass, we identify which files are config files. So that has sped things up quite a bit. And then the other thing that we've been focusing on is what we can move to the daemon process. So because the daemon persists between command line invocations, it can have this kind of like persistent cache of like in-memory cache of like what the current project graph is, what the current like file hashes are, and also things like what the task hashes, right? So the newest addition is the task cacher. Anytime you run a task now, hopefully a lot of the hashing has been cached already in the daemon. So you'll see your actual build start up with less overhead than before. So overall, that has kind of given us another performance boost, and we're going to be continuing to do more performance improvements in the future. Welcome back, Yuri and Zach. Well,
Yeah,
welcome, Zach.
I'm
Now you
here
got two
completely
of us.
extraneously now.
No, keep on. Yeah, we have like some.
I did want to
really...
add to something that Jason said there. I think we mentioned this in the video, but when we look at our benchmarks are kind of, it's not like a perfect benchmark, but if you look at the sort of the benchmark we had set in the test case, by our measurements, we improved performance by almost double, which is nuts because we're already like, I think the test case we use is we built like an app that has a whole bunch of projects in it. I forget the number exactly, but we were doing that in like a fourth of a second. We've got it down to like nearly a tenth of a second now, which I don't know. I thought that was crazy. But yeah, Yuri, just so you know, we didn't cover the NX console stuff yet. If you want to head there next, and with that, I'll drop off. So we'll see you all in the comments.
Yeah, stick around because like the thunderstorm is not over here. So I got the complete power loss like for a couple minutes. So
Oh, okay. I'll
pretty
just
rough
hang around then.
Yeah, just to be sure. All right. Yeah, for the VS Code setup, VS Code enhancements that we made, let me actually quickly show that off. We have it in a blog post as well. But basically, if you use NX Console in VS Code or WebStorm, we recently revamped our UI. So let's go, for instance, I don't know, generate a new library. So you can see now the whole like UI looks different if you have been using it before. So there's a much cleaner thing on the top, like a nice button, a nice copy button.
Are you sharing your screen? I think you're.
Oh yeah, I'm not
sharing
sharing.
screen. Yeah.
Here we go. So if you open up, this is VS Code, but it's the same thing that we did also for IntelliJ and WebStorm. So the whole UI has been rewritten by our team at NX Console. So you can see those that have been using it before might notice it, that they look a bit nicer, I feel, like in terms of design as well, how they're laid out in terms of the table of contents there, being highlighted where you are and like what options you actually filled out there. Plus the top level region has been kind of fleshed out much nicer now. Like the copy button doesn't feel out of place. It's nicely there alongside the generate button. So really nice improvements there. And we also have on our blog, if you go there to kind of blog.novel.io, there's a deep dive into what we did. So Max, who was the one mainly working on this, kind of did a technical deep dive on how we rewrote our previous UI, and now it is using lit elements. I believe, Zach, you also had a video on it, right? So there should be a video linked, or at least you can find it on YouTube. Kind of walks a bit through that stuff as well. So that to give a shout out to our NX Console team, definitely check that out because that's extremely useful as you keep developing your applications with NX and NX workspaces.
All credit goes to Max on that one too. He pretty much handed me that video on a platter, and I just read it.
Nice. Cool. And there have been some questions as well in the chat about like how to, I guess like this is more how to use Prisma with NX. And it kind of ties nicely into our next topic, which is about NX recipes. And so we have been working on a repo that is under NX recipes, which is our host for all kind of example setups that don't have a native plugin at hand. So where we don't generate something natively, if the page loads. I'm also going to share it actually in the chat so people can check it out. And so we're working on a bunch of examples there to showcase how you can use NX and integrate it with various types of technologies, even combining various types of technologies. So maybe, Jack, you want to kind of chime in a bit there as well, as you have been working on a couple of those.
Sure. So I think the main motivation for this repo is to showcase NX in different contexts. Like there's a bunch of frameworks and stuff that we support with executor generators and other things. But there's also some people who may be using technologies that we don't have plugins for. So if they use, for example, Playwright's not the right one. Oh, I guess someone mentioned Prisma. So like Prisma, how do I use it with Next.js and Express? Like we don't have a generator to say like generate the Prisma thing, but they can check out the recipe. They can see how it's set up. And if you read the README of all the individual recipes, they'll describe what it is and how it's set up and the things that you should like watch out for, or not watch out for, like things you should pay attention to. So that's the whole point behind all these recipes, is to show different setup. And we're adding a bunch more. So if you have any requests, like I did tweet out a while ago, I think we got some like suggestions for that from that tweet. We're currently looking at even adding quick view. I think Gatsby we're adding back, even though we deprecated the plugin. We can still use it because like NX doesn't need the plugins to work. The plugins just make it a little bit nicer to work with, but like you don't need it. So there'll be a bunch of different ones. Even non-JS languages will be here. So we're planning to show something in Golang, Rust, something in Java, maybe like Spring Boot. Gregory has a .NET plugin, so we'll show something with .NET as well. And I guess it's a complementary thing to our tutorials and our Create NX workspace as well, because Create NX workspace brings you through like different prompts and end up with something. But like these things are not going to be ever inside those prompts. Like we're not going to ask you about Prisma and Redis and all these things. So at that point, we want to bridge a gap between, okay, now you have a workspace and that's cool for a demo, but how do you get it to like a production ready app? So this is going to bridge that gap there.
Yeah, also because I feel sometimes there's the kind of misconception that if there's not a plugin, like especially for those people that have been accustomed to use NX plugins, so they look around for it, and if there's not a plugin, they kind of feel blocked. And so I feel like this is also a very nice learning resource where people can chime in and look at like various, like some of these combinations and how we actually wire these up, right? And so kind of get inspired from that and kind of feel more flexible in how they can use NX.
Yeah, hopefully even for like some of the framework authors, like when we did the Fastify integration, we got lots of feedback from Matteo. So if like someone's out there looking at Remix or whatever, like if you see something that we're doing that you're like, hey, that's not idiomatic, like you can submit a PR, we'll take a look and merge it.
Exactly. And we keep adding like a bunch of those. We are also working, like this kind of ties nicely into the whole improvements that you're working on the docs side of things. So some of these examples, or many of these, we call it recipe examples, will also be kind of featured on the docs more prominently. So they will be also nicely findable when you are on the NX docs and browse them from there as additional ways to set up some of these technologies. Cool.
Shout out to Teen, offered to put even more plugins there in the chat. That's awesome, man.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the best thing is probably reach out over the issues. Like I said, like we don't kind of already are in the progress of creating some of these, right? So we can coordinate on them, but like contributions are always welcome, 100%. Cool. I guess we are already, unless we missed something, we're already on the what's next section to wrap things up. So what are some of the cool features that we're working on in the next iteration? Who wants to chime in?
I can start real quick because I also have cut off because I have to go pick up my daughter. But currently, like my main focus, and Miro is part of this, and a bunch of other people, is to make sure NX is the best tool out there for building TypeScript libraries and like TypeScript packages. So a lot of the things that we mentioned, like the lint rule, all those things go into it. We're also reworking some of the tutorials and stuff that will just make it a little bit easier for people to get started. So by the end of this year, if you're starting to look at, well, not end of this year, but like in the next month or two, if you're looking to start a TypeScript project, it should be like a no-brainer to just start it with NX.
There's a bunch of really cool improvements coming along that way. Yeah, 100%.
And I guess a quick preview. We haven't really announced this, so I don't want to go too much into it, but there is something we're doing with project references with TypeScript that's going to make things super fast if you have a large mono repo. So there's a blog post, I think, that's pending. So watch out for that in the next few weeks.
Yep. I have also something like Yarn PNPM support on my list. Miro, is that something you work on?
Yeah, finally, after all this time, we started working on PNP support for Yarn, and Mal has been very helpful in giving us tips on how to overcome certain challenges. So kudos to him. And yeah, hopefully we should have this soon. So there were a couple of obstacles because a lot of our code was explicitly expecting there are some packages in Node modules, while with Yarn PNP there's nothing in Node modules. So you have to kind of look for packages elsewhere or be okay without having information from Node modules. So those were main challenges. But apart from that, it's coming along quite well. So we should have it soon.
Miro, could you explain what exactly is Yarn PNP?
So Yarn PNP is, and it's not just for Yarn actually, also PNPM has PNP support. So what it does is normally when you install packages with npm or yarn on PNPM, you get your packages installed in your node modules. And then depending on the package managers, they are either laid out flat or they are nested, and also different package managers have different way of parsing them and keeping them in some store or cache. But what PNP does is it actually keeps just one central repository of all the packages, and then your log file simply links to that folder. So there's never a package being copied from that repository into your node modules. So your node modules is completely blank, and all the packages are there in one place. And this speeds up normally installation because you don't have to copy files and you don't have to take them from npm or yarn registry over and over again. They are kept in your local registry and you can use them for different projects. So it speeds up the installation tremendously.
It's really cool. What does PNP stand for?
Plug and play.
Plug and play. Okay, that makes sense.
Next up, I have also something interesting, which I'm personally quite excited about, is the whole project inference API around our plugins. So we have quite worked a lot. Like we have already seen today, like the way to create a new CLI package, way to generate new NX plugin workspaces. And the project inference API is a particular way to hook even more into like how our plugin system and how NX works, specifically like the project graph. If you're going outside like JavaScript languages, for instance, that we already natively support, right? So, and I know Gregory has been working quite a lot on that, and there's some more stuff coming. So, Gregory, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I can talk about it briefly. So essentially, we were working on changing up how we read Angular.json in particular, was when this problem presented initially. And if we wanted to use it to dog food our project inference APIs and effectively infer projects from our Angular JSON. But the current API only lets you say, hey, this is a pattern that matches a project file. It doesn't let you say, hey, the project is located here. It just assumes that your project is in the same directory as your project config file. And also it has a strict limitation there of you can only have one project per each config file. And that just doesn't work for Angular JSON. It can have multiple projects, which most of us already know because, you know, that's how NX used to have its config. So we're looking at changing that up. You'll be able to provide multiple projects as a result. From any config file, you'll be able to say, hey, this config file points to a project that's located in a different folder. That will also kind of inline the ability to register targets. So it will be one thing now instead of two things. It'll be a way to build projects that contain targets instead of a way to identify projects and then later add targets to them. And then the other side of that is we'll be changing up our project graph support to be explicitly part of it is adding nodes and part of it is adding dependencies. We're still finalizing what that API looks like, so I don't want to go way too much into that just yet. But if you have an existing plugin, it should continue to work without changes until at least NX 18, at which point we'll most likely be flipping the switch over to the V2 only.
Yeah, one of the big things is that we kind of see like the way that we write our graph plugins is like we always do a pass to get all the nodes, and then we do a pass to get all the dependencies. And like we like currently all the plugins, they like take a graph, they give us a new graph, and like that's very big and powerful, right? You can just write one function that does all of it, but it doesn't allow us to like chain them together in kind of like in parallel or anything like that. So if you end up creating dependencies to projects that haven't been processed into the project graph yet, it gets a little awkward. So that's kind of the basis behind it.
And then the other side of that is if you were using a project graph processor and you added a node to the graph, and that node represented a project, which is one way that you could do the multi-project files right now. The file map has already been built at the point that we run those processors. So the projects wouldn't have any files associated with them. So there's just a few things that would break. So we're, taking another stab at it. And the important part is that after this, they should no longer be marked experimental. So we'll have stable APIs that we use that other people can use.
And then it will be flooded with content around this from our side, right, Zach?
Yes, sir.
Cool. Right. So I want to be cautious about the times. We're already a bit over it. One point I still have on, and feel free to go to our blog post. I'm gonna post a link again, or Zach, if you have it in hand, post it in the chat again so people are aware of it. There's like a bunch of other stuff going in that as well. And one thing that we are also working on, or which Katrina is working on, is storybook tests, which I also want to mention quickly because a lot of our folks that use NX use it also in combination with Storybook. So Storybook, they integrated a way to do component level testing natively, so in Storybook. And we're similar to what we had previously that we did over Cypress component testing or Cypress end-to-end testing. And so now we're looking into actually supporting those Storybook tests more natively. So that might be interesting for a bunch of folks that use Storybook heavily with NX, which we know is kind of a big use case there. Before we jump ahead, I also want to bring up NXConf again. It's happening again, September 26th in New York. Now the New York event will be invite only, so we on purpose want to keep it small, easy to organize for us, since we're just a bunch of folks, just a couple of folks on the team here. But it will be online for free for everyone. So we're currently fleshing out the agenda and speakers. Will be around all things NX, monorepos, tooling, productivity, and that range. So we will shortly having the entire schedule online. So be sure to follow us on our channels. And there will also be then a link up here where you can register for the online attendance, which again is free for everyone. So yeah, you will hear a lot more from us in the next couple weeks. Awesome. Zach, I already plugged it, but if you want to plug also the stream on Thursday with Brandon?
Yeah, me and Brandon are going to reprise the old NX Live format, and it's going to be me and him. We're going to go over analog.js. I don't know anything about it yet, so he's going to teach me all about it. I think you mentioned earlier, Yuri, they're considering using NX for their task runner right out of the box. So we'll talk about that too and see how that's going along. And hopefully we'll build something cool. So come check it out. It'll be fun.
Awesome. And with that, I guess we can wrap it up. Thanks everyone for chiming in, hanging out with us. Bye.
To everyone. Bye.